Hope that was a nice little refreshing coffee break. We've got 3 back-to-back panels that are going to be fantastic. My name is Corban Teague. I'm the director of the Human Rights and Freedom Program here at the McCain Institute. For this panel, we're looking at U.S. policy towards Russia. Now, Russia remains one of the most dangerous threats to the United States and our democratic allies. Russia's unprovoked, full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 clearly demonstrated both the level of threat and the level of destruction associated with Putin's expansionist ambitions. To discuss how the United States can counter this Russian aggression, we have a fantastic panel, starting with my immediate left. We have Stephen Biegun, Senior Vice President of Global Public Policy at the Boeing Company. He has more than 3 decades of international affairs experience in government and the private sector, including notably as Deputy Secretary of State, as well as other high-level positions with the White House and Congress. Next, we have David Kramer, the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. He has served 8 years in the State Department, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. And notably for today, he is a McCain Institute alumni, having worked as a Senior Director here. Next, Brian Whitmore is an Assistant Professor of Practice at the University of Texas Arlington McDowell Center for Global Studies and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's also the founder, author, and host of the Power Vertical blog and the Power Vertical podcast. And from 2007 to 2017, he worked as a senior Russia analyst for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And last but not least, Matt Zweig is a senior director of policy at FDD Action. Previously, he worked as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. From July 2019 to December 2020, Matt served as the senior sanctions advisor in the Office of the Special Representative for Syria Engagement, and prior to that, he served from 2001 to 2018 on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I have to mention that both Matt and Steve wrote sections of a new report that the McCain Institute recently released with our partners at the Vandenberg Coalition entitled A Conservative Strategy for Countering Russia. This is a great report outlining policy steps needed to counter Russian aggression. You can read that report in full by going to either the McCain Institute or the Vandenberg Coalition's websites. Thanks to both of you for doing that. And to moderate our panel, we have Dr. Karen Donfried, the Director of the Congressional Research Service and a former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. All yours.
Thank you so much, Corban. It is such a delight to be here. First, because it is the McCain Institute's inaugural Washington Forum. So kudos to Evelyn Farkas for this. And I have the great pleasure of moderating a fantastic panel. There is so much brain power on this stage about Russia. And I think we all understand the challenge that Russia poses to us, and certainly the threat Russia poses to many of its neighbors on the European continent. And Corban mentioned this report on Russia that was recently released by the McCain Institute and the Vandenberg Coalition. And as he mentioned, 2 of our panelists contributed to that report. I commend it to you, but I want to play off of the contribution that Steve Biegun made to that report as a way to frame this conversation we're going to have about Russia. And the way Steve thought about what is the path forward for U.S. policy toward Russia, he delineated 3 goals: defeating, deterring, and containing Russia. And if we use that as an organizing principle, I want to begin by asking Steve to summarize that argument for us. So Steve, over to you.
Well, thank you, Karen. And thank you all for inviting me here today to speak. Over the past 3 years, we've all spent an enormous amount of time focused on how to help Ukraine win its war of independence against Russia, against the full-scale invasion. And, of course, that was the right place for us to apply our energies. But I think we also all sense that the sands are beginning to shift, whether it's the departure of one U.S. administration whose mantra was as long as it takes, or an incoming new administration with a view towards bringing an end to the war, whether it's the battlefield realities, the grinding, fighting that's going on in eastern Ukraine, or whether it's the fact that voices on most sides, but not all sides, have begun to openly consider what the contours of a negotiation and perhaps even an eventual peace may be. I think whatever they cause, all of us sense that the sands are shifting here. And therefore, as we approach at least what may be the end of the beginning of this war, it also is very much incumbent upon those of us who think about this part of the world a lot to think about what U.S. policy towards Russia should be. And of course, the specifics of that policy will be very much affected by the outcome of the war, not just in terms of territorial settlement, but political settlement and other matters, affiliation or non-affiliation with international institutions like NATO or the European Union, et cetera. There's many things to come that will ultimately dictate the specifics of our policies. But I summed it up in the paper that Karen referred to in three broad categories. The first was to defeat Russia. And in a sense, Russia has already, at least preliminarily, suffered a significant defeat. Putin has suffered a preliminary defeat. By defeat, I mean that Putin's objective was the complete subjugation of the nation of Ukraine. He invaded a country, but he found a nation, and that nation hasn't been subjugated and very likely will not be. But that interim victory depends upon the outcome of the peace as well, on whether we preserve a Ukraine independent, sovereign, and democratic. The push for defeat is very likely going to move from the battlefield to the negotiating table, because the realities on the ground, while there's always a possibility that the fighting spirit of a 1 million-person army in Ukraine for people who are fighting to defend their homes could be sufficient to turn back and even reverse the Russian aggression. And it's possible that Putin has hidden weaknesses that we don't know about. And so there are, I would never rule anything out completely. But I think we have to assume at the moment we're in that the likelihood that defeat will come on the battlefield for Putin is less so. And therefore, it is all the more important that defeat come at the negotiating table. And again, that's going to involve tough negotiations. And one important aspect is going to be the preservation of a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine. And the other is that it has to be secure. And that's going to be where the burden really falls on us. We debated a lot over the last several years, what is the definition of victory in Ukraine, or what does defeat look like? My definition is very simple, is that if the outcome of the war is something that Putin himself is incapable of selling in Moscow as victory, then that will be defeat. And we need to understand that Putin can sell an awful lot as victory in Ukraine, but two things that he can't are the survival of an independent Ukrainian state that is secure, in my view, preferably as a full member of NATO. The second part of my strategy, or my recommendations, is to deter. There's only one person who's responsible for this horrible war, and that's Vladimir Putin. But we do ourselves have some areas of responsibility where we failed. And if it's nowhere more evident, it is in our failure of deterrence. Knowing what we knew in October and November and December of 2022, with the 21, with the confidence that we had, and to which we persuaded many of our allies, that Putin had made the decision to invade, what might we have done in hindsight to deter that from happening? And what price could we have avoided? What cost could we have avoided had we deterred Russia at that time? Deterrence is going to require us, both through policy and military preparation, to ensure that Putin does not take another inch of Europe, pure and simple. And that burden is going to fall significantly upon our European allies. This is going to be a U.S. responsibility, but it is going to be primarily a European responsibility. And so all the initial steps that the Europeans are taking to bolster their own defenses have to continue. Absent that, we will have another failure of deterrence, and we will be fighting another war, and perhaps a larger war in Europe within a very short amount of time. The third part of my recommendations is containment. I am not an optimist here, to say the least. I do not believe we will have the opportunity to even have a normalized relationship with Russia for 2 or 3 generations in the future, if that. We need to really adjust our mindset to the fact that we will not be going back to the way things were before this full-scale invasion began, much less before 2014. We are not going back. Russia's not going back. As much as we wish, or some might wish, that we could put this relationship with Russia back together again, even if Putin falls in some way or leaves office, there's no likelihood, in my view, that his successor will be any easier for us to contend with. And so we need to put our minds to work on a longer-term containment strategy that involves the sanctions, that involves confronting Russian mischief and aggression and efforts to undermine self-determination in places like Latin America, or the Sahel, or Sudan, or North Africa, Libya, in the Middle East, in Syria. It brings me no joy, and to me, it's a reversal of 40 years of engagement towards an ever better relationship between the United States and Russia since my first study in the Soviet Union in 1985. But this is the task in front of us.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for that overview, and I think you all can understand why I found this such a useful frame for thinking about U.S. policy toward Russia going forward. And I'd like to dig into each of the elements of that framework. And David, I know that you have spent a lot of time thinking about how we support Ukraine in the face of Russia's war against it. And in Steve's argument, that first element of defeating Russia, the war in Ukraine, factors very prominently. And I'd love you to share your perspective on this.
Sure. Thanks very much, Karen, and thanks to the McCain Institute for bringing me back to D.C. on a beautiful, warm day, just like in Dallas. It is great to be on this panel with such experts here. I would say the most critical thing is to defeat Russia in Ukraine. It's Steve's first point. And if we don't do that, I think the other two recommendations that Steve makes will not follow. I too recognize where we are today on the battlefield, but I do think that there is still the possibility for the incoming administration to rectify what I think have been 3 mistakes of the outgoing administration. One has been incredibly slow and painful and frustrating decision-making process when it comes to weapons requests from the Ukrainians. The incoming Trump administration has an opportunity to expedite that and to provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs when it needs it. And then that leads me to the second rectification that the Trump administration can make, and that is to lift restrictions on use of those weapon systems, which I think has been an equally frustrating source for the Ukrainians when it comes to the United States, grateful as they are for what we have done in providing them with such assistance and keeping the alliance together. And then the third one is, and Steve touched on this, it is dealing with NATO, where I think the current outgoing administration had an opportunity in Vilnius last year and then in DC this year to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO and didn't do it. An invitation to Ukraine to join today would not be membership for Ukraine tomorrow. It would be a years-long process. But in not doing so, it has essentially de facto granted Putin a veto over Ukraine's NATO aspirations. And I think this is the third area that the incoming Trump administration can address. This one may be the least likely, given what we've heard when it comes to the views of some of the people coming in. But I think if framed in the way that the incoming administration has a chance to do things differently than the outgoing administration, those are the three areas I would focus on. I think the best way of dealing with Russia is to help Ukraine win. And I think, again, here too, as long as it takes is not sufficient, or to defend itself is not sufficient. I think the failure to articulate that our goals and objectives when it comes to this situation are Ukrainian victory and Russian defeat, the failure to articulate those, I think, have been a mistake. And I think there is nothing better we could do for Russia at the end of the day. Maybe not the current regime for sure, but the best thing we could do for Russia is to defeat it, help Ukraine defeat it in Ukraine. And that would also protect the other countries in the region too, and even further afield than that, Syria, other parts of Africa and elsewhere. So to me, the best way of dealing with Russia, the best way of defeating Russia is to assist the countries along Russia's borders and in Russia's neighborhood, starting first and foremost with Ukraine, continuing with Moldova. Georgia is another one which I follow pretty closely and have been very frustrated by the Biden administration's slow approach in imposing sanctions, starting with Benzina Ivanishvili and the Prime Minister and others on down, particularly in light of what's happened with the terrible use of brutal violence against peaceful protesters. And then the Baltic states, we can't take for granted. And in fact, the way to strengthen deterrence, the second point Steve made, and I know you're going to move on to Brian with this point, Karen, but the way to strengthen deterrence is to make sure that our NATO allies, and most particularly the Baltic states, are strong and defended. The last thing I'll say is there are two tendencies that I think need to be debunked. One is fear of escalation, that Putin will use tactical nuclear weapons. I've never bought into this, including back in the fall of 22, when apparently the intelligence community here thought that there was a chance. And Putin's rhetoric, Medvedev, who's his stupid puppet as well, when they make these claims they're going to use a tactical nuclear weapon, it is to get us to back off and to self-deter and not provide the assistance to Ukraine that it needs. Every red line that Putin and the Kremlin have drawn has been crossed off and crossed over, and we have not seen a serious move in this direction. The second one is fear of what might come should Russia be defeated in Ukraine, what might come after Putin. We have no control over that, other than helping Ukraine win. Nor should we be blinded by concern about what might come next. What might come next, Steve may be right, will be worse than Putin. It may be the same as Putin. It may be better. We don't know, and it's beyond our control. Where we should focus in helping to defeat Russia is by helping Ukraine achieve victory. Thanks.
Thanks so much, David, and I think you make so clear why this is an opportune moment to be revisiting our strategy, because we can look back and see what are the lessons we can learn and what does that mean for policy going forward. And I did want to bring Brian into the conversation specifically on this question of how best can the U.S. deter Russia. And Steve said very clearly the goal here is to avoid another failure of deterrence. So Brian, bring your deep expertise to bear on this.
Thank you very much, Karen. First, I want to start. I wholeheartedly agree with David. Everything flows from defeating Russia and Ukraine. If we don't defeat Russia and Ukraine, the rest of this discussion is moot. There can be no discussion about deterrence, and there certainly can be no discussion about containment, because Ukraine is the West Germany of our time. Right? And losing Ukraine right now would be akin to losing West Germany in the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s. So I begin with that. I also agree with David that we need to correct some errors of the outgoing administration, the slowness on the weapons, the restrictions, and the enlargement of NATO to include countries in the Eastern Partnership countries of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and we need to debunk this fear of escalation. And I want to apologize in advance. I think I'm kind of going to be a skunk at the garden party right now, because there's a meta question we really need to answer right now. Do we have a traditional administration with a traditional U.S. foreign policy, Democratic or Republican, coming into office? Or do we have something else, right? This is the meta question that's bugging me right now. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about on this panel, I couldn't get around this question. So I said, all right, to hell with it, I'm just going to say it. Since November 5th, I've had a lot of conversations with European friends and colleagues. And I always say, only half jokingly, I got good news and bad news. Bad news is it's 1941. Good news is this time you get to be the Americans. Or maybe the bad news is this time you have to be the Americans. Now, I don't know if I truly believe this, but it's something I'm thinking about. And when I look down at the data points since November 5th, following what's being said in Russia, I'm not encouraged. The day after the election, Vladimir Putin gave a speech in Sochi, which can only be described as a victory speech, proclaiming the death of liberal democracy and the rise of a new Russian-led world order, a world safe for dictatorships, right? A world where Russia has carved out its sphere of influence in the former Soviet space, and we can do nothing about it. Is Putin overconfident? I don't know. We'll see. Everything's contingent. Days after the election, Nikolai Patrushev, one of Putin's top foreign policy advisors, gave an interview to the Russian daily Kommersant, in which he said, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting directly, so I don't have the quote in front of me, but the gist of it was, Donald Trump has obligations to those who assisted in his election, and he must meet those obligations. And then after this, as an aside, and I'm almost uncomfortable saying this publicly, Patrushev, apropos of nothing, said, oh, and by the way, 4 American presidents have been assassinated, and I hope the Secret Service is up to its job. That was chilling. When I read that, that chilled my blood. This was a Tony Soprano-like mafia threat, right? So this is where Russia's at right now. And then I'm looking at things like the appointment of, the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence. Many of you may know, Russian state media refers to her as Nasha Podruga, or our girlfriend, right? When I look at the elements of Kellogg's peace plan, they are identical to the elements of Putin's preferred peace plan. Freezing the conflict where it is now, Ukraine gives up that territory and promises never to join NATO. It's basically total capitulation. So is this what is coming in? Or not? Because if this is what's coming in, I find it hard to have a conversation about deterrence, defeat, or containment. Now, if I'm wrong about this, and I hope to God I'm wrong about this, right? If that's the case, and if we are seeing a traditional American foreign policy, then we can proceed and talk about defeat, deterrence, and containment. Everything flows from a victory in Ukraine, right? Do we see the incoming administration being more forward-leaning on this than the outgoing Biden administration? Color me skeptical. I'd love to be wrong. But let's just say I am. Yeah, a defeat in Ukraine would lead to deterrence and containment, because a defeat in Ukraine for Russia would create what I call a 1989 moment. I wrote about this in Foreign Policy early on in the war, that if Russia is defeated in Ukraine, it's going to create this window of opportunity for Georgia, for Moldova, and I dare say even Belarus. You know, David, you and I have spoken about this. Now, it looks bleak on almost all of these fronts right now. David, you and I were just in Georgia in September for the McCain Institute conference there. We both were meeting with opposition leaders. The mood was, to put it mildly, very grim and glum. Belarus, of course, is Belarus, but I've never been willing to give up on Belarus. And Moldova looks a little bit brighter, right? Maya won re-election resoundingly. So a defeat in Ukraine would create a situation where you would be able to go to deterrence by denial, right? Because we're talking about deterrence, we talk about deterrence by denial. which is effectively creating this ring of countries around Russia that cannot be penetrated. And this is assuming that these countries become NATO partners and eventually NATO members. It means shoring up NATO, specifically on the eastern flank. And then this leads to containment. But again, everything is contingent on this first meta question that I ask. And I apologize for being the skunk of the garden party, but if we don't address this, we're in denial. Thank you.
All right, I made a note of the meta question, which we will come back to. But before we do that, I want to bring Matt into the conversation, because the last piece of the strategy that Steve outlined was containment. And in Steve's argument, are the economic arrows that we have in our quiver are an important part of containment. And Matt's done a lot of work thinking about how the U.S. can effectively employ sanctions. So Matt, share your perspective on the containment piece.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me here today. And I'll be relatively quick here, so we can get to a broader discussion on the three elements that Mr. Biegun outlined. First of all, I think it's a matter of effectively employing the asymmetric tools at our disposal in a more effective way, right? That should be the objective, to meet all three components in the economic sphere. But also, as Mr. Biegun mentioned, if we're transitioning from a battlefield to a negotiating table, it's also critically important to build out leverage using those asymmetric tools ahead of time. So in the sanctions sphere, the Biden administration there have been a number of innovations under the Biden administration in terms of the application of coercive economic measures, right, to include the use of sanctions, export controls, anti-money laundering, regulations and requirements, et cetera. And it's almost been forced by the sheer scale of the sanctions that we've had that have been imposed on Russia. And kind of in our space, what we call the convergence, right? The convergence issue, in as much as sanctions, export controls, anti-money laundering, and kind of the other coercive economic measures on the liability side of the scale have largely existed in multiple sanctions regimes as separate kind of as separate kind of stovepiped. There's been quite a bit of stovepiping of those efforts, and Russia has kind of forced them all to kind of come together and work as kind of a synchronized, a bigger synchronized mechanism. So one of the things that at least I argue in the McCain-Vandenberg piece, is that while there have been a number of innovations, there have been a number of missed opportunities on the sanctions front, the best way that we can gain leverage, or at least to expand leverage, is to move from is to basically revise the underlying syllogistic construct, which is the current sanctions regime permits commerce, right, moving from a conduct-based sanctions regime to a comprehensive sanctions regime. And the basic construct is, except for X, commerce is permitted. And then moving from that underlying construct to commerce is prohibited except for X. And that is kind of a major shift in the way that we viewed and the way that we've executed the sanctions regime up until this point. So that's kind of the major recommendation that at least we developed as part of our piece here. The other component is understanding where both domestically and multilaterally our own capabilities gaps are, because this is going to be a long-term prospect, right? Sanctions are not going to go away with respect to Russia anytime soon, but they will evolve. And it's constantly being in a position to ensure that an asymmetric tool is truly asymmetric, and ensuring that we not only that the United States and our allies have both the capabilities and or at least identifying and ameliorating capabilities gaps in our own structures, right? So how many targeters do we have in Treasury, at state, in our various institutions, focusing on Russia? Do they have what they need? Well, and it's not a matter. It's a matter of both just signaling. It's a matter of being able to build the capabilities to implement a long-term containment strategy, not just with respect to Russia, but with respect to our other foreign adversaries. Russia by itself is a major threat to the United States national security. Russia, Iran, China, and other foreign adversaries do also. When you're dealing, in that case, you're dealing with a consolidated threat, and our sanctions policy really needs to look at, kind of the broader continuum in addition to what do we do to help shape negotiations and ultimately, work to build kind of a broader containment picture moving forward.
Super, thanks so much. And really great to have these perspectives on the table. And as promised, I think we should return to Brian's meta question, which is, all of this is really compelling to us, but is this a traditional administration coming into office? And do his colleagues on the panel think the elements of this sort of a policy toward Russia would appeal to the incoming Trump administration? So Steve, let's come back to you on that. Based on what you know so far, what has been said both by President-elect Trump and others who have been named to his foreign and security policy team, how would you respond to that meta question?
Yeah, I think it needs to be unpacked a little bit, because a normal administration within the bandwidths, but on an issue like NATO enlargement, I've exhausted myself trying to convince the Biden administration to make the right decision on that. So to hold that as a test for the Trump administration on whether or not they're a normal administration is a disqualifying factor for the Biden administration. And quite honestly, public opinion isn't there at present, and I don't think there was a candidate running in either party who advocated for NATO enlargement. And so it's not to say it's the wrong policy, but there's a lot of work to do to get any president or administration to do that. Another one that I think needs to be unpacked a little bit is Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg's plan that he laid out, which again he was closer to where mainstream opinion is in our views, Brian. And I'm with you on how you think about this conflict. But we have to recognize that our views are the ones that aren't mainstream. They may be right, or we may have the conviction that they are right. But there is not an elected leader in the world today, a democratically elected leader, that's calling for the restoration of all of Ukraine's territory. There is not a single candidate who ran for the presidency who was advocating for Ukraine's membership in NATO. Those are fundamental political realities. And so the frustrations are appropriate, but the frustrations should be channeled into shaping the policy. Now, I think General Kellogg is an outstanding pick. He has some key criteria for a successful negotiator. One is he has the trust of the president. But second, and I know General Kellogg, he's a solid, experienced American military leader, and his instincts are going to be good. And the comments that he's made on the record since he's received the appointment have been tremendous. I commend you to his radio interview on the Guy Benson show about a week and a half ago. There's nothing in there that I didn't make me more enthusiastic about his appointment. The last thing I would say in this respect is that no president, even if you accepted the possibility that this would be the worst case scenario, no president operates with a completely free hand. We have the institutions of our government, our Congress in particular, and Congress has a point of view on Ukraine. As hard as it was to get the aid legislation through the United States Congress in April of last year, when it was finally voted on, 70 United States senators voted to deliver $61 billion in assistance to support Ukraine in its defense of its independence. 70 senators. In 1997, 1998, when we passed the resolution of ratification for NATO enlargement, we had 70 United States senators. Same vote. 1998, the ratification vote. In 1949, when the United States Senate voted to ratify the North Atlantic Treaty to create NATO, we had 70 United States senators. That's a remarkable consistency across 75 years. We have public opinion. Public opinion will be shaped around the realities on the ground in this war. If the Ukrainian government, in the worst case scenario, collapsed, and millions more Ukrainian refugees fled to Western Europe, where good, decent people were driven from their homes, where courageous leaders were arrested, imprisoned, or worse, public opinion would not support that here in the United States of America. I can say that with absolute conviction. And there's a certain law of physics in politics, which is second-term presidents consider their legacy as part of their policy impulse. President Biden's legacy was stained by the abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan. President Trump will not want Ukraine to be his Afghanistan.
So, David, keeping in mind Brian's meta question, Steve's response to it, and Steve had said in his initial opening that we're at a time in Russia's war against Ukraine where he sees the action moving from the battlefield to the negotiating table. I want to have you respond to this from what you suggested the Trump administration needs to do, right? Which is expedite weapons to Ukraine, lift any remaining restrictions on weapons that Ukraine is using, and NATO membership. So how does your argument fit into what we've heard?
In a few ways. First is, it is an enormous mistake, and none of us on this panel has done this, but it's an enormous mistake for anyone to underestimate the Ukrainians. Look at what they have been able to achieve with the assistance we have provided, regaining more than 50% of the territory that Russia seized initially, essentially destroying the Black Sea fleet, inflicting more than 700,000 casualties on the Russian side and killed and wounded, reaching targets deep inside Russia, in large part with their own indigenous drone capability. The list goes on. And the Ukrainians have been unbelievably heroic and standing up to a much larger threat. So never underestimate the Ukrainians. The second comes directly to your question, Karen, and a point Steve made. Never overestimate Putin's readiness to negotiate. He has indicated numerous times, as have his spokespeople, Peskov and others, that the only settlement he would agree to is essentially the takeover of Ukraine. Certainly recognition of the four regions that Russia has illegally annexed, including parts that it doesn't even currently control. It means the removal of the current government in Ukraine, and it means the permanent neutrality of Ukraine. I don't know how that is even the start of a negotiation. And it's something that we should not even entertain, in my view. So Putin, there's also one other thing here. Don't think that Putin is brilliant. If Putin were brilliant, he wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. It's been a tremendous disaster for Russia, a horrible thing for Ukraine, obviously. But it has been, to borrow a Khrushchev, or a term used in the Khrushchev days, an incredibly harebrained decision that he made to do this. Don't think that Putin and the Kremlin are smart enough to play games with the United States. And picking up on Steve's point about General Kellogg, he delivered a pretty good response to Konstantin Malafeyev this week, if you follow that. Where Malafeyev said the only thing we would sit down and talk with the United States about is the entire world, not just Ukraine. And Kellogg essentially told him to go to hell. I found that response and a number of things that Steve was referring to since, even soon before, but since his selection as the special envoy, reassuring in this case. There were reports, and I'll end with this, that President-elect Trump called Putin soon after his election victory and warned Putin not to escalate. Now, Peskov said this never took place, but Putin has escalated, not in a nuclear sense, but with the massive bombing of civilian targets and energy facilities. Putin may overplay his hand here. and he may piss off Donald Trump. And one thing I think we could say is that the Trump administration could be pretty unpredictable. So I've said numerous times since the election here and in conversations with journalists, let's not prejudge things. Once he assumes office again on January 20th, and with a number of the picks that Steve was referencing, this may actually turn out to be something the Russians would wish had not happened. So let's wait and see.
Super. And time is racing, and I want to get people's perspectives on one other dimension of this conversation. And that has to do with the role of our European allies. Each of you mentioned it in a different way and suggested that how the Europeans respond to this conflict going forward is critical. We saw the French government fall. We have a German government that has called for new elections in February. So there is extreme political and economic weakness in key European countries. The Balts are all in supporting Ukraine, the Poles are all in, but that is not necessarily true across the European continent. How does that play into the conception of a U.S. policy toward Russia? I mean, Matt, let's start with you, because certainly staying power of sanctions matters if the Europeans stay the course.
Well, I mean, I think with the upcoming 15th round, that should be a pretty clear signal as to the direction of travel over the next year. Whether the U.S. and the EU continue, right, this one-step, two-step, right, sometimes replicative, sometimes complementary when it comes to sanctions designations, will also be kind of a critical indicator of, the strength of the policy. And to the Biden administration's, to calling balls and strikes, a number of their sanctions designation packages over the last few months, particularly using some secondary measures, have kind of signaled strength in that respect. So, that's one aspect of the of the sanctions play here. But it's also a matter of, if we expand sanctions, ensuring that we do so in a way that doesn't undercut the overall, the broader superstructure, not getting into not trying to get too far into the weeds here, but the European sanctions superstructure and the U.S. sanctions superstructure are not necessarily compatible. I mean, to be perfectly honest, be it Japan and Korea, we have an easier time coordinating with, just based on that structure. So ensuring that there are not opportunities politically for the Russians to interfere or to engage in what's kind of known as regulatory arbitrage in order to engage in sanctions circumvention and sanctions evasion, activities, is another key kind of component here. In terms of what I'd identify as being important to watch moving forward.
Great. Brian, you had said this is a 1941 moment, and Europe, you get to play the role of the United States. How concerned are you about European weakness?
Less concerned than I was. I go to Europe fairly frequently. I'll be going on Sunday to Germany. I have these conversations every time I'm there, and what I'm seeing in the run-up to the election and since is a realization that Europeans have to prepare for what they call a post-American future. Now, as an American, as an Atlanticist, that breaks my heart. But as somebody that kind of looks at this kind of what we're facing right now, it also warms my heart at the same time. So, I mean, and we've seen President Macron talking about creating an autonomous European defense capacity. Right now, I think that's probably a pretty good idea, and I think the Europeans are getting increasingly serious about it because they're not stupid. They see the Russian threat. The threat is more acute the farther east you go, but I think the French and the Germans, and as goes France and Germany, so goes Europe, are beginning to see this. I'll have more to say when I get back from Germany next week. If I may, just very briefly, in response to all of the responses to my meta question, to paint a more optimistic picture, there are some positive signs I'm seeing. I'm seeing Republican senators, friends of Ukraine, making the argument that there's a lot of money to be made in Ukraine and there's deals to be cut, and Ukraine has rare earth metals and things like that that are strategically important to the United States. They seem to be playing to things that will get a response from Trump. I mean, I specifically saw Lindsey Graham speaking about this on cable news not long ago. Mitch McConnell seems to have drawn a line in the sand in the Senate. We'll see how that turns out in terms of some of these nominations. So it's not as bleak as I painted in my opening remarks, but I just thought we do need to address this, because if we don't address it, we're in denial. Thanks.
Super. And David, you were so right to say we should never underestimate the Ukrainians. But they do need money for budget support. They do need weapons to continue fighting. How do you think about the role of our European allies in this?
We're apparently about to provide $50 billion in financial assistance to Ukraine from the interest of the frozen $300 billion that we have. It is unfathomable to me that coming on the third year of this war, we have not moved from freezing to seizing those damn assets. I can't imagine any scenario in which we would allow or should allow Russia to regain control over those assets. And for those who are worried it sets a dangerous precedent, well, if China invaded Taiwan, I would seize Chinese assets too. Otherwise, we give countries that have assets in Western financial institutions a pass to do whatever the hell they want. And so it frustrates me to no end. And the Europeans, I think Matt would know this much better than I, particularly in Belgium with Euroclear, are the source of this frustration. And so we need to get past this in order to make funds available. Russia should pay for what it has done in many different ways. Not the least is financial. And there's $300 billion sitting in Western financial institutions, and all we're doing is drawing on the interest that those funds are making. We can do a much better job there.
Great. And Steve, to you, in the piece you wrote in the report, you wrote about the surprisingly strong response from America's NATO allies. Do you see that continuing, absent U.S. leadership on this?
I do, and I do commend the many countries in Europe, particularly our NATO partners, but others as well. They have done a lot, but that also should not distract us. They need to do more. They've done a lot. We should be mindful at the generosity of the Europeans to help the Ukrainians in every way, including absorbing refugee populations, supporting their economy, but also in providing them the means to defend themselves. But they have to do more. And if they do more, this could be a very important turning point in the future of the transatlantic relationship, because a more balanced European contribution to NATO is probably the most important thing our European partners can do to ensure an enduring transatlantic bond for the next generation.
Well, yes. They've cut you off,
They
David.
cut me off, as they should have done at the beginning. There's nobody who wants this war to end more than the Ukrainians. They are the ones who are suffering and dying every single day, but they want it to end in a way that it never happens again. They are not asking us to send our brave men and women to go fight this fight for them. They do need our assistance. It seems to be the minimum we can do is to help them in this and let them decide the course of this war rather than for us to do it and impose it on them.
Thanks so much. I think the clear message from all four of our panelists is that as we think about a path forward for U.S. policy toward Russia, what happens today is profoundly significant for the foundation of that policy. And I think our four panelists have made all of us much smarter about how to think about U.S. policy toward Russia. So please join me in thanking them.